The rehabilitation session had lasted longer than usual. Ray could still feel it in her arms. Every movement had been repeated, corrected, started again with that stubborn patience that defined the clinic's therapists. Stand, sit, straighten, find balance again, over and over. By the end, her legs still responded, but with that heavy slowness that turned every step into a conscious effort. Alyssa gently pushed the wheelchair down the corridor. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. For several weeks now, they had learned to recognize those moments when Ray simply no longer had the energy to communicate, not even with the tablet. Her hands rested on her thighs. She could still feel the fatigue vibrating in her muscles like an echo of the effort.
You did very well today,
Alyssa said softly. Ray gave a slight nod. She had no desire to read encouragement on a screen. She already knew the session had gone well. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the exhaustion that always followed. When they reached the common room, the familiar scent of tea was already drifting into the hallway. Alyssa slowed instinctively. The door was open. Afternoon light filled the room, catching on the white porcelain teapots and the neatly arranged trays of pastries. Tea time had already begun. Ray observed the scene without much reaction. Some patients were seated in the armchairs, their quiet conversations blending with the soft clink of cups. And as always, Madame Leclerc occupied the center of the room with the calm assurance of someone who had decided the space belonged to her. She spotted Ray immediately. Her face lit up.
Ah, there's our favorite convalescent.
She raised her hand enthusiastically.
Alyssa, bring her here at once. You cannot let her slip away without at least having some tea.
Alyssa glanced at Ray. Ray hesitated. She would have gladly continued straight to her room. The chair suddenly felt heavy beneath her, as if the fatigue had settled into every muscle in her body. But Madame Leclerc was already beckoning them, with almost comical determination. Ray let out a silent sigh and made a small gesture with her hand. Alyssa understood. The chair shifted direction. Madame Leclerc immediately pushed a tray toward them.
Sit, and take a pastry before these ladies empty the entire tray.
She cast a conspiratorial glance at a woman seated near the window.
I won't name names, of course.
The woman looked up from her book.
I can hear you perfectly well, Leclerc.
All the better,
she replied with satisfaction. Alyssa positioned Ray's chair near the table. The warmth of the tea filled the room. Madame Leclerc poured a cup with almost ceremonial care and placed it into Ray's hands.
There. Much better for recovery than all those dreadful protein drinks.
Ray slowly closed her fingers around the warm porcelain. The heat spread through her palms. She remained silent. The fatigue still weighed on her shoulders, and she simply let Madame Leclerc's voice fill the space, as always.
You've arrived just in time for today's column.
Madame Leclerc continued. She leaned slightly toward Ray, as if the entire room should not hear what came next.
You see, our dear Mr. Lambert does not meditate in the garden at all.
Ray barely lifted her gaze.
Yes.
She knew him, always seated beneath the cypress trees, eyes closed, perfectly composed. Madame Leclerc continued, clearly delighted.
He is simply hiding from his third wife.
She raised a finger to emphasize the gravity of the situation.
She arrived this morning with 2 lawyers and an entire suitcase full of documents.
She shook her head with perfectly theatrical sympathy.
I'll let you imagine the atmosphere in their suite.
Despite herself, a breath escaped Ray. Almost a laugh, Madame Leclerc noticed immediately.
You see?
She exclaimed with satisfaction.
I knew my stories had therapeutic value.
Alyssa smiled softly. Madame Leclerc took a sip of her tea.
But that is nothing compared to last week's affair.
She lowered her voice, as if about to reveal something even more delicious.
You see that blonde woman over there?
Ray followed her gaze vaguely. An elegant patient sat near the window, distant, composed.
Officially, she's here for stress.
Madame Leclerc continued.
But the truth is a little more dramatic.
She leaned in slightly.
A desperate attempt after her own daughter decided to cut all contact with her.
Madame Leclerc gave a small shrug, almost sympathetic.
Family matters are always the most tragic.
Ray did not move. The cup in her hands stilled completely. The warmth of the porcelain was almost burning her fingers now, yet she did not loosen her grip. Something had tightened deep in her chest, and this time it had nothing to do with physical fatigue. The heat became too much. The porcelain burned against her skin. Ray felt it clearly, but she did not let go of the cup. Her gaze remained fixed somewhere ahead, unmoving, as though Madame Leclerc's words were still suspended in the air around her. Her own daughter, cutting all contact, the words repeated in her mind with a strange slowness, as if someone had written them inside her skull. The fatigue made everything blurrier, rawer. She no longer truly saw the room. She saw only fragments, the light from the window, the white tablecloth, and Madame Leclerc's voice with that sentence repeating again and again, her daughter. Ray's fingers tightened around the cup. The pain finally surged, sharp and burning. Still, she did not move. Alyssa was the first to understand something was wrong. She had learned to observe Ray without waiting for words. She saw the tension in her hand, the fixed gaze, the uneven rhythm of her breathing.
My lady?
Her voice was low. Madame Leclerc, still mid-story, stopped immediately. She followed Alyssa's gaze and saw the cup. The porcelain trembled slightly between Ray's fingers.
Oh.
The word slipped out, far more serious than her usual chatter. Alyssa leaned in at once.
My lady, the cup.
Ray did not respond. Her fingers did not move. She no longer seemed to feel the heat. So Alyssa gently placed her hand over Ray's. A calm, careful gesture.
Let me take it.
She slowly loosened Ray's grip and took the cup before it could slip. The porcelain made a soft sound against the saucer as she set it down. Silence settled. This time, Madame Leclerc did not speak. She watched Ray with a new kind of attention, far sharper than before. Her gaze moved briefly between Ray and Alyssa. Then she understood. The light conversation had touched something real. And for once, Madame Leclerc had the tact not to ask questions. She simply pushed the pastry tray slightly away, as if the table had suddenly ceased to be a place of entertainment. Alyssa remained beside Ray, calm and attentive.
We're going back to your room,
She said softly. It was not a question, but Ray had not moved yet, because in her mind, one thought had taken over everything.
Kanté.
And for the first time since she woke up, the word no longer felt like a memory. It was an absence. Alyssa did not insist further. She simply placed a light hand on the back of the chair and turned it toward the corridor. Madame Leclerc did not try to stop them. For once, she remained silent. Conversation resumed behind them, but in much lower voices, as if everyone had instinctively understood that something had just passed through the room. The corridor was quiet. Ray did not write anything on the tablet. She did not ask for anything. She simply allowed herself to be taken back to her room. When Alyssa gently closed the door, the space returned to that particular silence of convalescence. Ray remained in the chair for a while, her hands resting on her knees. The fatigue from rehabilitation still weighed on her muscles, but it was no longer only that. Something else had settled in. Something much older. Alyssa prepared the room with her familiar precise movements, curtains drawn, the blanket adjusted, and the tablet placed on the bedside table.
Try to rest a little,
She said softly. Ray gave a slight nod. She allowed herself to be helped onto the bed. The mattress welcomed her tired body with an almost deceptive softness. Alyssa lingered for a few seconds. Then she left. When the door closed, the silence returned. Ray stared at the ceiling. For a moment, she thought the thoughts would come back. The memories, the images, and the anger. But nothing came. Only an overwhelming fatigue, and that word still drifting somewhere in her mind.
Kanté.
She closed her eyes and sleep eventually took her. Night fell without her noticing. The room was in darkness now. Only the faint light of the city filtered through the curtains. And Ray opened her eyes. She didn't know why. The silence was complete. And for the first time in days, Arjun was not there. Usually, even in her most unsettled moments, he remained somewhere in her thoughts, a presence, sometimes a voice or a memory. But that night, there was nothing. Only her, and the vast space left behind by absence. Ray remained still, and the word returned.
Kanté.
And this time, there was no anger, no defense, only a slow, quiet pain. The tears came without her realizing, one, then another. They simply slid along her temples, disappearing into her hair. Ray made no sound. She did not try to wipe them away. For once, no one was there to watch her or to ask her to be strong. So she cried without words and witness, like a mother who suddenly remembers that she has lost her daughter.